Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of GeoSpace.
I'm Mohammed Salih, your host. Glad to have you with us today. GeoSpace is the new region's biweekly live series here on X, where we explore the shifting dynamics of Middle Eastern politics. We examine power struggles, regional rivalries, the strategies of global players like US, Russia, China, and others, all through the lens of both immediate developments and long term trends reshaping the region. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by someone who has long followed Syria and especially the Kurdish question there, Sirwan Kajjo. Sirwan is a journalist and a researcher specializing in Kurdish politics, Islamic militancy, and Syrian affairs. He has contributed chapters on Syria and the Kurds in volumes published by Indiana University Press and Cambridge University Press. His work has appeared in the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, the Middle East Forum, and other leading think tanks and publications. He's also the author of Nothing But Suit, a novel set in Syria. Sirwan holds a bachelor's degree in government and international politics from George Mason University in Virginia. In today's episode, we will unpack the situation facing Syria's Kurds, both in the current moment and looking ahead as a new government has taken hold in Damascus since December last year. We will also revisit key moments from the past decades. Long oppressed and marginalized Syria's Kurds have managed their own affairs since 2012 when Bashar al Assad's forces withdrew from Kurdish majority areas in the north and northeast following the popular uprising in the country that erupted in 2011. But the Kurdish autonomy now faces serious threats driven by shifts since Assad's fall last year and mounting pressure from both the new government in Damascus, but also the government in Ankara. Still, not all is bleak, as we will explore in this conversation. A quick note before we begin, we will run for about an hour with 45 to 50 minutes of discussion, followed by time for your questions. You can drop those in as replies to this post, to this space, or request the mic to join live. And if you miss any part of the conversation, don't worry. Each episode is repackaged as a podcast available on the New Region website under the watch section, as well as on the YouTube and SoundCloud, usually by the end of the following day. Thank you again for tuning in. Sirwan, welcome to GeoSpace. It's great to have you with us today.
Hello, Mohammed. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. I know people tend to focus more on the heavy political and geopolitical questions when it comes to Syria, especially these days. But let's start with your personal story, which in many ways is, I assume, emblematic of the broader Syrian Kurdish experience. What was it like for you and your family to be Kurdish in Syria under the rule of the Assad family?
I was born and raised in Rojava or Syrian Kurdistan. That's the Kurdish region of northern Syria. I was there until the age of 19 before I left for Lebanon for school and stayed there for a couple years. And then I moved to the United States at the age of 21. My experience as a Kurd, living in Rojava, was similar to millions of others who were my contemporaries, or also those who came, the generations that came before me, since basically the establishment or the creation of the modern states in Syria. And for the most part, in the sense that Kurds were heavily marginalized from political life, from public life in general. their culture and language were suppressed, and their very identity was banned. So growing up, by virtue, Kurds, the minute they're born, they're viewed by those in power, the authorities, as oppositionists, because they've always regard Kurds as a threat, which is a bit ironic if you think about it, because historically, Kurds have never sought, of course, in modern times, to take power in Damascus. Kurds have always, you know, attempted, for the most part, up until the civil war, to achieve their cultural and linguistic rights through peaceful means. Yet they were still viewed suspiciously by the Damascus authorities. So for us, like many other Kurds in other parts of Kurdistan, the very idea of being a Kurd was a defiance against all odds. Kurds were able, despite all the attempts to ban their language, for example, still maintained it over the decades, especially under the Ba'ath rule, which started in the early 60s and intensified under Hafiz al-Assad. But of course, those anti-Kurdish policies started way before that. I probably would say that the golden age and after the creation of the modern state in Syria started under the French mandate, where Kurdish culture was tolerated. Kurdish magazines and newspapers were. Kurdish intellectuals that were able to publish in Kurdish, and there was a movement that kind of revived the Kurdish culture, especially as a lot of intellectuals, Kurdish intellectuals from Turkey, from Bakur, were fleeing to Syria, seeking newfound freedoms. Yet those were quickly taken away from Kurds as successive nationalist government took overs. Ironically, some of whom were the leaders, especially the period where many military coups took place. Many of those leaders came from Kurdish backgrounds. Particularly from central Syria, so places like Hama and Homs and Damascus. Yet they did not identify as Kurd. They were, if anything, they were more like Arab nationalists. Still, Kurds managed to keep their identity from joining into the broader Syrian identity, which was predominated by Arab nationalism, which was at the peak at the time. Like I said, it only intensified during the short-lived union between Egypt and Syria, and thereon, we all know how the Assad dynasty tried to both strike a balance between growing Kurdish aspirations and a growing sense of Kurdish nationalism in other parts of Kurdistan, particularly in Iraqi Kurdistan and in Turkey. And as the Assads managed to do that up until the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, which, like you said, Muhammad, the Kurds were able for the first time in Syria's history, able to carve out a semi-autonomous region that, for the most part, remained safe. Despite attempts by terrorist groups like Jabhat al-Nusra at the time, and then later on ISIS or the Islamic State, and of course the Syrian government, the Iranian-backed militias, as well as the Turkish government, the Turkish military, and the Turkish-backed Syrian militias, which we can talk about later over the course of this conversation.
Sure, Sirwan. Let's talk about your name. Your name refers to a river in Iraqi Kurdistan. Is there a story behind why you were named Sirwan? If there's anything
Yeah,
interesting you can tell
there
us.
is. Of course, yeah, that's a very interesting question, because my father grew up when there were during the peak of revolutions in Iraqi Kurdistan, and he was heavily influenced by the revolutionary spirit in Iraqi Kurdistan at the time, and he was also himself highly educated. He grew up during French Syria. He spoke multiple languages. He spoke Kurdish, Arabic, English, French, and a little bit of Turkish. So he was aware of the Kurdish aspirations in Iraqi Kurdistan and other parts of Kurdistan as well. Of course, at the time, there wasn't much going on in Rojava or in the Kurdish region in Syria. So all eyes were on, especially on Iraqi Kurdistan, and to a certain degree in the Kurdish question in Turkey. And my father had a friend from Iraqi Kurdistan who was a member of the Iraqi Communist Party at the time. As you know, Muhammad, a lot of the leadership from the Communist Party in Iraq, just like in Syria in the 30s and 40s and probably until the 50s and 60s, were Kurds or of Kurdish background. So but of course, the communists of the time were completely different from the communist movements that emerged later in Iraq and Syria, that were mostly pro-Arab. No, this sense of combination of both Kurdish nationalism and a way that the communists at the time were trying to promote Kurdishness through a communist platform. Yeah, my father, like me, my other brothers, I have a brother named Feridun, which is not a very common name in Rojava in Syria. Mine as well, and a couple other names that were named after figures from Iraqi Kurdistan, cultural or political figures in Iraqi Kurdistan. So this also shows, Muhammad, how integrated the Kurdish question has been over the years. Of course, each part of Kurdistan has its own set of, dynamics that have driven the causes of these Kurdish causes separately. But also, there's a unifying factor that has historically brought the Kurds together, and that is that sense of, unity. I'm talking about the popular level, at times even at the political level between the Kurdish political parties, but there's always been that sense of solidarity between the Kurds and all four parts of Kurdistan. Just a side anecdote. I was in the seventh grade in Syria. I was at the time 12 or 13-year-old boy, and trying to figure out my own identity, where we decided as a group of Kurdish students. I mean, 99% of the students in my class were Kurdish. Was born and raised in the city of Hamoudi, and we decided on the March 16 to stand up, take a moment of silence in respect of the victims of the Halabja genocide, and the entire class decided to join us. It was a small group of people that took the initiative, including myself, and then that gave courage to other students. We were like about 30 or 35 students in that class, where everybody stood up, and a Baathist teacher was probably from Homs, as I remember, decided to basically punish the class by bringing in the principal, who was also had to by law had to be a Baathist, and that the entire class was actually suspended until our guardians decided to, or they were called in for interrogation and stuff like that. So things like that always happened in Rojava or in the Kurdish region in Syria, which gave meaning to being Kurdish. Certain aspects of like unlike Turkey, for example, where Kurdish, the use of Kurdish language was absolutely banned out by law in Turkish parliament. It was the same in Syria, although there were less restrictions, and there at times those same restrictions were relaxed to respond to certain political developments in the country, especially under the Assad. Assad was a shrewd politician who knew how to manage the different communities across the Syria, as country as diverse as Syria. But for us as Kurds, it was always a challenge to define the authorities by expressing your own your own ethnic identity. And Syria, as you know, has was never meant to be a country the way it is or had been over the years. So you, instead of creating a comprehensive nationwide Syrian identity, the successive governments that took over Syria over the decades made sure that they were different communities were excluded from politics, which ultimately led to these regional and ethnic and sectarian based identities to emerge, including Kurdish identity, of course, which was more prominent than other minorities by the size of sheer size of the Kurdish population in the north, but also because how vibrant the Kurdish people historically have been in Syria over the past century, since the 1920s, I would say.
Sirwan, let's dig a little deeper into the question of identity. You gave a very fascinating account of your life as a child, as a young man in Rojava in Syria's Kurdistan. What it mean, what did it mean to be a citizen in a state that effectively criminalized your whole identity, right? I mean, you or any Kurdish child going to school at any of the towns and cities across North Syria, they would be sitting next to other students from different backgrounds, Arab students, Christians. Being in this kind of situation where you as a Kurd had, your entire identity, culture, and language basically being rendered illegal by the state, but the Arab kid next to you, had a totally different experience. So the language of education in a school was in Arabic. Your Arab friends, for example, language, or the moment you turned on the TV, it was in Arabic. Every street sign was in Arabic, even though the towns in Rojava, the cities, were majority Kurdish. How did that sort of early feeling of realizing that you were the citizen, or the subject of a state that did not want you as who you were and wanted to transform you and turn you forcibly into someone else?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Thank you for asking that. I think, a lot of people don't get, especially within the Syrian spectrum, and definitely the current political landscape that is evolving in Syria, is that the Kurdish question is much bigger than what's happening right now. We're talking about the local dynamics or, regional dynamics, what it involves the Syrian Democratic Forces and Kurdish forces in general, the relationship vis-a-vis Damascus. Now and during the Assad, era, something very, very essential that is missing in this conversation, and I also believe that has a lot to do with the failure for the Kurdish political movement to be able to, raise more awareness within the broader Syrian context, how to promote the Kurds in a proper, in a effective way. So that, essentially, this is a human rights issue. The Kurds have historically been deprived from basic human rights. I mean, the right, that rights that have been enshrined in UN charters, like the right to speak your mother's tongue, the right to express your own cultural identity, things like that Kurds, that everyone else, including the Arabs in Syria, took for granted. Kurds were deprived of, and this is something that people don't quite understand or pay attention to. Is like this struggle that the Kurds have endured for decades. It's not really about a struggle for power, or for achieving more political rights, although political rights in this context falls within identity rights. Like, this is something that I think, I said earlier that the Kurdish political movement should be blamed for, but of course, that's not entirely on them. It is the successive governments, especially the Ba'athist in Syria, that made sure that Kurds were always seen as outsiders. Although we all know Kurds are indigenous, one of the indigenous peoples of Syria, and have contributed over different historical periods to the development of Syria, the state of Syria as we know it. And but Kurds have always been portrayed as outsider secessionist people, a group of people who were have always tried to cede part of Syria and partition it and add it to a foreign land. By the way, since we're talking about it, one of the very common accusations in court, like court charges in Syria under the Ba'ath regime, myself included, I got that charge when I left Syria, when I was in Lebanon. The propaganda that was used against myself, people like me, and many other Kurdish political activists, especially the young ones, were that we were trying to take part of Syria and add it to a foreign country. Of course, they wouldn't name what a foreign country is, and this contract is the state of Kurdistan, but that charge would be used against you in any action that the government, the regime deemed as threatening. This could be, in my case, it was working for a Iraqi Kurdish channel in Lebanon, and before that, distributing flyers. Or actually, it was in my case. When we were trying to collect as many signatures as possible and send it to the UNICEF to basically say that Kurdish children in Syria deserve to learn in their mother tongue. And so we were taken into interrogation. This is shortly before I left for Lebanon. And one of the accusation was that we were trying to, cede part of Syria and attach it to a foreign nation, which is bizarre, outlandish, and ridiculous if you think about it. Nonetheless, that continued, and the struggle also continues. So the more stubborn the government were with regards to denying basic rights, the more defiant Kurds became in their activism and in their discourse and in their very being, which currently reflects on how Kurds deal with politics, especially when it comes to negotiations with whoever is in charge in Damascus. And I think this is what is really important. And again, this is what is missing in the conversation, that the Kurdish struggle in Syria has been about first cultural, linguistic rights, and then about political freedoms and democracy and others that mainstream Syrians would normally fight for. Our struggle was always double because of these very many grievances that we have experienced in Syria for decades.
That's really interesting, and following the debate, at least on social media, among the people who were involved in the Syrian revolution, activists, the intellectual class in that country. I have a sense that the rest of Syrians, the Arab population in Syria, both at the elite and at the popular level, do not still have a very good understanding of the Kurdish, struggle, of the Kurdish suffering in the state of Syria, in the modern state of Syria. Do you think, do you agree with me on that, or do you think there has been any sort of, heartening, major change of attitude in Syria on the part of the, country's Arab majority, both at the elite and popular level, toward Kurds and, the Kurdish question in that country?
Yeah, well, it's actually a very tricky question, because the issue at its core is about understanding each other, and this is what the Syrian regime, the former regime, the Ba'athists, excelled at, making sure that the different communities did not trust each other. There was always this tensions, especially between Kurds and Arabs. Arabs were, from a Kurdish perspective, viewed by pro regime, regardless of their political tendencies. Any Arab, for the most part, by Kurds, were viewed as, collaborators with the regime. On the other hand, Kurds, like I said earlier, were viewed with suspicion because they were always portrayed in the regime propaganda that they were this group of people who wanted to secede from Syria, and that created a narrative that unfortunately continued even after the fall of the Assad regime in December of last year. It created a new culture where Kurds were always viewed as second class citizens. They were definitely treated as second class citizens, but they were also viewed as second class citizens. It changed, of course, as more interaction happened between, Kurdish students from Rojava, for example, from Qamishlo or Kobani or Afrin or other cities across the region, went to universities in Damascus, Latakia, Homs, and Aleppo, and these were the major state universities, and because of because the Kurdish region also has historically been economically marginalized. The richest, which is a bit ironic, the richest region in terms of resources, was also the poorest in terms of per capita income, which explains why certain economic policies were also targeted or designed in a way to target the Kurds and other rural areas. Just to be fair, not only Kurds were targeted in Assad's economic policies over the years, but also others and elsewhere in what we know as what we or the regime termed as rural Syria. But still, those interaction in universities and campuses were not enough to form, you know, a a larger level of trust between the Kurds and other communities, not only the Arab majority, but also other like Christians who a significant portion of them lived among Kurds, especially Armenians and Syriacs, but also Christians from other communities across Syria, as well as other like the Alawites and the Druze in the south. The regime always made sure there was this rift, like a visible disunity between the different communities. Because it was the easier way for them is conquer and divide and conquer, and the regime for the most part succeeded at doing that. And the evidence is how the current government in Damascus, which we can talk more about it later on, but as viewed the Kurds, still views the Kurds and Kurdish demands as unrealistic and secessionist, which is again absurd if you look at the core of the Syrian problem or the Syrian issue. At the beginning of the Syrian conflict, it goes back to which this is a bit anecdotal, but I think when the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan and Iraq Kurds were demanding federalism at the very early stage of the, after the liberation of Iraq in 2003, Kurdish demand for federalism, even though it was accepted and enshrined in the constitution, still the Arab majority viewed it with suspicion. Later on, and everybody else, including many in the elite and the Shia majority in Iraq, and definitely the Sunnis, realized that this was a demand they actually could benefit them too, and they started making similar demands, if in different, to different, degrees and effects. The same thing is happening in Syria now. Certain demands that the Kurds called on early on in the beginning of the Syrian conflict in 2011 and 12, leading to the rise of ISIS in 2014, were viewed as unrealistic by Kurds. Demands for decentralization, for a federated system of governance to avoid the bloodshed that would ensue later on. Of course, nobody listened to the Kurds at the time. The majority of the Kurdish movement were calling for concrete actions to prevent the violence from, going further. Was like, hey, there's still time to sit down and negotiate how we should govern Syria together. Nobody paid attention to what the Kurds were saying. And now, if you look at the political spectrum, there, the many segments within the Syrian society are calling for what the Kurds called for a decade ago. If you look at the Druze community, if you look at the Alawite community in the coast region, they're all calling for something, if not identical, similar to what the Kurds have called for and also managed to establish over the past few years. So, yeah, to go back to your question, Muhammad, I think there's still that mistrust that is there, that this former regime worked so hard to implant in the Syrian psyche, and when it comes to accepting Kurdish identity as is, or just being open to how diverse Syria is. I mean, this is something that people don't often talk about, is that nearly half of Syria's 24 million population is non-Muslim, non-Arab. When I say non-Arab, I also include like non-Muslim, like the Alawites and the Shia and different Arab communities within the Arab communities. The Sunnis make up 55% of the country's population, roughly. But the remaining 40% are Kurds, Alawites, Christians, Druze, and other smaller ethnic and religious and sectarian minorities. And so it's important for people to understand that Syria cannot be treated as one country, one color, one flag, one language, because it's not. And the experiences of the civil war, especially of the civil war over the past 14, 15 years, show that it didn't work. The Assads tried it, they failed big time. Others had tried it before the Baath era, they failed. So there should be a recognition of this reality. There should be an acknowledgement of this reality. And yeah, it's a long road, but Kurds have learned, to survive it. And the Kurdish people in general is a resilient group of people. So no matter what policies have been designed to target them or to discriminate against them, Kurds have managed to come out even stronger, following those actions.
Sirwan, we'll get more into that side of the sort of intercommunal relationship in Syria, but let me take you back in time to 2004. This was, I assume, one of the important formative moments for the people of your generation in terms of their political identity. So there was a football match, a soccer match in March 2004, in a stadium in Kamishlo, one of the major Kurdish towns in Rojava. And then there was a fight that broke out between the fans of the local Kamishlo team and the visiting team that was coming from Deir ez-Zor, a majority Arab province in Syria. I read your mother's excellent autobiography in Kurdish Kurmanji about that particular day, and that you had gone to the stadium to watch the football match. Tell us a little bit about your experience first, being there, as a young man in that stadium, and the bloodshed, that ensued, and the crackdown by the security forces on that day and the following days, and how it was like for you as a young person, and in what ways it really sort of shaped your identity as a Kurd in Syria.
Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting episode. Well, stage in the, not just for me personally, although it was very important, but also for the Syrian Kurdish history at large. I think, up until that point, the Kurdish politics in Syria was confined in, you know. Issuing monthly publications or newsletters by political parties, or occasionally staging a small time protest in front of the Syrian presidential palace or the Syrian parliament. But it never reached that popular level where the entire society participated in a massive protest movement against the Syrian government. And it all started there. And yes, my mom eloquently talks about this in her book. I was 18 at the time. This is 2004. A year, exactly a year after the topple, the collapse of after the Americans toppled the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and Kurds in Iraq were seen as one of the major victors of that liberation war. And Kurds were Syria very excited about where their brethren in Iraqi Kurdistan were achieving or about to achieve, and working on their autonomy and contributing to the new government and the new governance structure in Iraq. Kurds were super excited about that. I remember myself every time there was an interview in Arab media with the late Jalal Talbani, the first democratically elected president of Iraq, or Masoud Barzani, the former president of the Kurdistan region. Everybody was excited. It's like, this is it. It's like your favorite show, and everybody's staying, glued to their TVs to listen to what these two, Kurdish leaders had to say about certain matters related to Iraq or Iraqi Kurdistan. So there was that would happen in Iraq, and the achievements that the Iraqi Kurds were making at the time gave a push to Syrian Kurds to be more expressive with regards to their own demand. And I think that the timing played a major role, although it wasn't the Kurds that started the massacre in Qamishli. I mean, the massacre was against them. So when I was there in early afternoon, and both teams were warming up for the game, and but before that I was as I walked by myself, and this is my last the senior year of high school. I managed to flee home to attend the game, and like at the door there were like unusually heavy police and mukhabarat intelligence presence at the door. But it was Syria, so I didn't. It wasn't usual, but at the same time, it was like probably one of those days they expect more Arab, fans to come from Deir Zor, which is about a 3-hour drive from Qamishli. So maybe that's why extra precautionary steps. So they were checked thoroughly. I remember I was secretly smoking at the time. I was 18, so I had a lighter on me, and they took it from me, which was very unusual. And someone next to me, and they took his pen. He had a pen on him. They took it from him. So everybody was experiencing the same things. Like they're like literally taking every belonging that had, no matter how small it was, from them. On the other hand, we realized something. The Arab fans were let in from another door, an opposite door, from the other side of the stadium. And I remember like a lot of them came in with bags, and we don't know what were in those bags. Of course, we would come to know that later as we experienced, like a rainfall of stones falling on us. As the players were warming up, we were cheering for our local team, which was also like a national team, because like 90% of the players were Kurdish. So it was another way to express your Kurdish identity at a sports event on the national level. And our team was one of the best teams in the Syrian league at the time. And so we were very proud to be we were very proud supporters. But as we were getting more and more excited about the game, we started hearing some pro anti-Kurdish and also pro Saddam chants. And Deir Zor historically has been a city that has identified, even from a Syrian government perspective, a pro-Iraqi Baathist region. I mean, being on the border of Iraq, you literally have families on either side of the border, tribal extensions on either side. So that loyalty, kind of an informal allegiance, within the Deir Zori community at the time, and that was more pro Saddam as pro Syrian government. It caused. I mean, it's a whole different topic, but that's how they were always perceived at the time. And then of course Kurds got really Kurdish fans got really upset when they heard like pro Saddam, anti Kurdish, like Kurds being traitors because they collaborated with the Americans and toppling Saddam, stuff like that. And then Kurds also got really upset, and they started making anti Saddam slogans, which quickly escalated as the Arab fans started to, throw stones at on the other side, and the police and the security forces at the game did not do anything. I remember I personally was injured twice, one in my hip and one in my head. I didn't realize until hours later when I went home. But then things quickly escalated. Three men were killed on during the clashes. Hundreds were arrested, but then the actual uprising happened the day of the funeral, when those three young men were taken to the cemetery. It quickly escalated into the funeral turned into a peaceful protest, and the same thing happened in other nearby cities like Amoud and Derik, and it went all the way to Damascus and other Syrian cities with major Kurdish populations. And it was, up until that point, the largest popular protest movement against the Syrian government in Amude. For the first time in Syrian history under the Ba'ath, the statue of Hafiz al-Assad, which were everywhere, literally everywhere in Syria, toppled. It was toppled. And it was a very, very unique moment, in not only in the Kurdish history in Syria, but also in the history of Syrian activism, anti-government activism up until that point. Sadly, it was faced with more violence and more repression. About 3 dozen more Kurds died on those, various protests throughout the region, and later on, thousands of people were arrested. Those who participated in the protest movement were arrested. Some of them spent about a year or two in jail, and then were released in a presidential pardon. But some of them were arrested and kept in jail until a few months ago. Many we still don't know anything about. They probably perished in jail without their families being aware of. And so, yeah, that moment was a turning point in Kurdish activism in Syria. And later on, there were many figures like Chef Mashouk Ghaznawi, which we can talk about later on. But the movement, the 2004 uprising, gave life to a new set of dynamics in Kurdish politics. Kurdish political parties became more active, and the Kurdish population in general became less concerned about their security when they took to the street to express certain things. And we saw more of these protests, although on a much smaller scale, later on in 2005, and then in 2006 and 2008 during the Nowruz celebration, when three young men by the same name of Muhammad were killed by Syrian security forces for their mere participation of the Kurdish New Year celebration. And so but that changed, and I think in retrospect we look at it as like, if the Syrian opposition and those who were active within the Syrian opposition was very small at the time, but not insignificant. Had they participated or backed the Kurds during that 2-day uprising, things could have turned out differently. Unfortunately, only few individuals within the Arab communities joined forces with the Kurds, and many risked their lives. For example, a couple of prominent, Arab activists from Damascus came in 2005 to attend Sheikh Mashouk's funeral after he was kidnapped and later on killed by the Syrian security forces. And then they risked their own lives.
Sorry, let me interrupt you there. You are raising a very interesting point, and I'd like to sort of fast forward to the 2011 uprising. But before that, then, let me remind our audience that if they have any questions, they can either send it in writing as a reply to this post, or they can request the mic. So let's fast forward to 2011. You have painted a very detailed picture of the background to the uprising, the Kurdish experience, a painful experience for the bulk of that history in Syria, the intercommunal relationship, and the lack of sort of broad meaningful support on the part of mainstream Arab opposition parties in the country for the Kurds in 2004 and in the subsequent years. So in 2011, I believe you were outside the country. You were not living in Syria anymore.
Sure.
The uprising happens. It's a very powerful moment, right? A very deeply established authoritarian system is openly being challenged by the Syrians. But the Kurds make a fateful decision. They do not, support either the Assad regime nor the opposition. Tell us, how that made you feel, or what was the rationale behind that sort of attitude? That the Kurds sort of, chose a different path and waited to see, what would happen before they would actually, decide to pick any sides. You know,
Sure. Yeah, I think, and I apologize for getting into the weeds every now and then. Please remind me to when I do that. But I think these are important details for people to understand the current, dynamics. History is very important to understand, especially recent history. So, yeah, in 2000, I think the decision. I mean, first of all, a lot of Kurds. I remember very vividly. I mean, we're only talking about 15 years ago. Kurds across the region in Damascus and Aleppo and Damascus participated in the protest movement very actively early on. Actually, way before many other cities joined forces with the anti-government protesters. Kurds were really there on the forefront of this new movement. The Kurdish demands were not as clear as they later came to be known. But I think those experiences, past experiences from 2004 and even after that 2005, and similar experience that Kurds were like, okay, if we join in the movement with all our might, and Kurds were much more organized and disciplined politically than their Arab peers, for example. The Arabs did not have that kind of political or organizational structural experience. Kurds had their own political parties. No matter how big or small those parties were, they still managed to be involved with underground politics until 2011. And so I think because Kurds were doubtful, really, they weren't sure if joining the opposition would really benefit them, or they would again be left alone, like what happened in 2004 and 2005. So again, the Kurds did participate in the protest movement, but it wasn't as forceful as the Kurdish political movement would have done it normally, up until of course, the rise of ISIS, where the entire all dynamics shifted toward the war on ISIS and the war on terror, and things started differently. But Kurds were still. It was a conscious decision, I think, in the beginning, is that instead of taking either, siding with the regime or the opposition, well, we will never side with the regime. Of course, this is the same regime that oppressed us for decades. There's no way we would consciously support a regime that supports that suppress other communities across Syria. But of course, the opposition was as clear as when it came to Kurdish demands and Kurdish rights in a new Syria. So the Kurdish transition to like a third path, if I may say. Was the result of certain unknowns at the time. Would the regime survive or not? Would the opposition be as deceitful as the regime has historically been when it comes to Kurdish rights or guaranteeing Kurdish rights or recognition of Kurdish identity in Syria? And I think that what led to the Kurds to kind of take their destiny into their own hands by building what later came to be the autonomous administration of North and East Syria, and of course certain factors contributed to that. Later on, the attacks by extremist groups and of course ISIS on top of that. And then the rest is history. I think that it's safe to say that it was a wise decision for the Kurds to keep it that way, because it spared the Kurdish region, Rojava, for the most part, not entirely, because remember, Kobani was entirely destroyed because of ISIS onslaught. Many other Kurdish cities came under attack by either the Syrian government or the opposition groups or ISIS. But for the most part, compare at least relatively speaking, the Kurdish region remained safe over the course of the civil war. And in retrospect, I think it was a wise decision for the Kurds to, of course, not stay on the sideline, because the Kurds did not remain on the sidelines. The Kurds were very active in building their own inner political enterprise that proved to be a viable option for governance in Syria.
Let's get to the present moment. The Assad regime fell in December last year after 54 years of ruling Syria, and we have had a new government under President Ahmed al-Sharaa, a new transitional government. How do you assess Sharaa administration's approach toward the Kurds and the Kurdish question in Syria? Should Kurds be hopeful and optimistic about him or not, given this history that Kurds have with the state in Syria?
Yeah, well, it's been 6 months, and 6 months for a transition is probably not long enough. Of course, countries that, especially those that transition out of dictatorship and authoritarian rule into hopefully democracy, tend to take longer to kind of end that transition period or go through that transition period. And I think this is what's happening in Syria, like a lot in the early days, days and weeks after the fall of the former regime, of the Assad regime. Everybody was optimistic and hopeful about, even though we all knew who these people were. We all knew who Ahmed Shara was, al-Jolani, even hours before the fall of Damascus, and who had Tahrir al-Sham was, and where they came from, and what their ideological tendencies were. That was known to everyone. But still, with change comes hope, always, as you should, as a human being. And I think that's what the Kurds and many other people did at the time. Unfortunately, for many people in general, including in the international community, they took a leap of faith in this new government. They gave them a chance. Also, okay, this is a new thing. We should try something else with them. But when it comes to the Kurds, I think the Kurds had no option. The Kurds have historically been very open to talk with whoever is in charge in Damascus. When when the Arab opposition and the Syrian government were holding their marathonic negotiations in Geneva, the UN facilitated talks. The Kurds had their separate talks with the Syrian government, which obviously didn't get us anywhere. But still, Kurds have always been in dialogue, like always preferring negotiation and dialogue over violence. And so I think this is what the current Kurdish authorities in Syria and Rojava are doing, is like, we've been trying many things. Let's give chance to dialogue, and I think that's what's happening. There's still a lot of issues that need to be addressed, and there's still that mistrust that the Syrian government made sure would linger way longer after its departure between the different communities, especially between the Arabs and the Kurds. and there's still that a lot of many of the misconceptions within the Arab community, and definitely within the political elite currently in Damascus towards the Kurds, and their attitudes reflect that. But I think the fact that they're talking is great. I think the fact that they haven't either side hasn't resorted to violence is a great sign. I'm just looking at the picture. I'm not as optimistic as I was a few months ago about the path for a peaceful resolution for the Kurdish question in Syria. What the Kurds want, the vision that Kurds have created, established over the past decade or so, is completely different from what the new rulers in Damascus really want Syria to see in the future. And I think at times that might come to clash. The two visions for a serious future are completely different. There might be still a lot of room for negotiation and compromise and concessions on either side. But knowing what we know and right now about the new authorities in Damascus, I think it's going to be a very, very bumpy road for the Kurds over the next few weeks, months, and years. And let's not put everything into the current talks between the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, and the Syrian government, because the Kurdish question is much bigger than that. And I think even General Commander of the SDF, Mazloum Abdi, said that in one of his recent interviews, like, we're only discussing security and certain matters in the region, like education and so on, and resource sharing, power sharing in certain parts of Syria. But we're not at a point where we can discuss Kurdish demands, because definitely the Kurdish issue is much more complicated than discussing it via two groups that are both essentially are military groups, even though the Damascus government would like to portray itself as the authorities that you should talk to in Syria. I mean, we're talking about Syria. I mean, a lot could happen over the next few months, but really the fact that both sides have decided to not resort to violence as a means of achieving goals is really a good sign.
Do you like, when people talk about the main Kurdish demand being some sort of self-rule, self-administration, is it from, your understanding, is this something that mostly the dominant Kurdish political parties, such as the Democratic Union Party, the PYD, or the Kurdish National Council, demand? In other words, is it something which is an elite political demand, or is it something that the ordinary average Kurd, especially the younger generation of Kurds in Syria, who have gone, from that horrible, painful experience of their parents' generation being, so severely oppressed by the Assad regime, to a situation where everything that was criminalized and illegal in terms of their culture and identity being fully legal and completely fine for them to engage in. Do you think that the leadership at the top feels a sort of degree of pressure from the average Kurd, especially the younger generation, to insist
Yeah.
on these Kurdish rights?
That's a very good question. People don't often ask such questions. Like, what do the people want, really? Is it the leadership? Is it the political elites that wants federalism, for example, or a decentralized Syria? I'm talking about the Kurdish political elite. It is actually way before both sides, the PYD or the Kurdish National Council, started demanding or making demands for a federated Syria. Way before that, years. I remember during the early days of the uprising, most of the signs in Qamishli and Afrin and elsewhere in Rojava, where they had this very explicit demand for federalism in Syria as a solution to not only the Kurdish question, but also to the question of governance in Syria. And I think Kurds are much more aware than that. And we're talking about 14 years. this is a long time to build a new character, in the Syrian Kurdish psyche. Most of there's a new generation that grew up speaking their language, learning their language, being active on different platforms and different, like Kurdish university for the first time in history in Syria, Kurdish language history run by Kurds, which have, these things have produced a new generation where they want to see themselves equal to their peers and elsewhere in Syria. So I think this is a very popular demand, being the fact that, Kurds have been, running their affairs for the past 14, maybe 12 years more appropriately, is a sign for this new Syrian government that there is a reality in northeastern Syria and the Kurdish region, that they need to address. They can't just ignore it with a blanket, with certain policies that the Assad was really effective at, like doing. There's a new reality in the Kurdish region. There's a new generation in the Kurdish region, new mentality in the Kurdish region that those in Damascus must recognize if they're willing to, build a modern state where all segments of societies participate in governing themselves. So I think, to answer your question, yes, these demands that, and the recent unity conference that was held in Qamishli a few weeks ago, was not only in response to certain regional and Syria and certain events happening in Syria, although they were in response and partial, but also these parties, both sides, were under pressure, a lot of pressure from their local support, from their supporters, people on the grassroots level that were just done with the old way of disunity and confrontations between the different political parties. And I think the fall of the Assad regime gave an opportunity for the Kurdish political parties for the first time in Kurdish history, I mean, in Syria, and that all Kurdish parties, regardless of ideology and affiliation, were able to come together and form a unified set of demands. Among them was federalism as a solution to the Kurdish question in Syria, but also the question of governance in the country.
Let me ask you one final question. What about the United States? So, since 2014, the US and the Kurds have been military allies in the fight against ISIS or the Islamic State. Do you think the US is playing its part to ensure a fair outcome for its Kurdish allies in a post-Assad Syria, or is this relationship ultimately a transactional one?
Yeah, I've been covering this partnership between the Syrian Kurdish forces and the United States since its inception in 2014 or late 2014, during the battle for Kobani. And I can safely say this is one of the most successful partnerships that the United States has ever had in the region with, mind you, a non-state actor. This is important to note that we're talking about a group that came out of the ashes. Basically, the Kurds did not experience armed struggle up until that point, really, up until the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, and then suddenly you have this reliable partner that is able to not only fight ISIS but build their own institutions in a very effective manner. I mean, it comes with a lot of flaws and it comes with a lot of issues and problems. We can't, nothing is perfect, but amid a devastating civil war, the Kurds were able to build this unique partnership with the United States. I think, first of all, it wasn't transactional. Even many in the military said that early on. It was not a transactional relationship because it's survived a lot of problems, regional pressures, and pressure from certain countries on the United States to end it or change it. It hasn't happened. With the fall of the Syrian regime, though, I think this administration, the Trump administration, obviously has been open about not only lifting the sanction but giving another chance for a chance to interim government in Damascus. I just don't think there were enough guarantees. There were basically the Syrian government before the Trump major announcement in Riyadh a few weeks ago about lifting sanctions on Syria and recognize, meeting with Ahmed al-Sharaa in Riyadh. Before that, Syrian government was willing to make significant concessions to be able to lift some of the sanctions, not all of them. But then Mr. Trump basically gave them basically everything, things that they would never dream to achieve in the next few years. Trump gave them that with nothing in return. When I say return, I think training like how to maintain this partnership with the SDF. There's still a fight against remnants of ISIS that a lot of people in the new Syrian government want to undermine, but it's real. ISIS is still there. Their threat is still there. You can judge by their recent, uptick in attacks in recent weeks. But also, like, the thousands of ISIS fighters and their families, including many foreigners, but also a lot of Iraqi and Syrian nationals that are kept in Kurdish guarded, detention centers and prisons in northern and northeastern Syria. I mean, what's going to happen to them? I feel like a lot of these questions remain in limbo after that move by the Trump administration to lift sanctions. Relieving these sanctions. Obviously, it's a great thing at its core. It's about giving the Syrian people a chance to reintegrate into the international community, both politically and economically. It will help. But what do you get in return? I mean, this is a transition, very precarious transition that the Syrian people are going through. Giving something like that is a sign for the new authorities in Syria that they can get away with a lot of things during this period, as long as the United States has given them the green light to reintegrate into the international community. So I think that was my only concern, my only reservation was like there weren't enough concessions or guarantees made, commitments made by Ahmed al-Sharaa and his government in return for the relief of all sanctions.
That's indeed a great point. Sirwan, we have a question, a written question. The book that you have written, Nothing But Suit, is it available in English or in Arabic as well?
No, it's actually I wrote it in English and I published it in 2015, so it's been 10 years. It's still relevant, so if people want to buy it, it's available on Amazon. It's Nothing But Soot. And yeah, I wrote it in English, so it's available in English, of course, on Amazon.
What about your mother's book,
Yes.
the one about her autobiography?
Yeah, so you read it in the original, the original version. You read the copy that my mom wrote. That's, by the way, the only language she speaks. My mom doesn't speak Arabic or English for that matter. But the book got translated to Arabic last year, and this year it will get published in English as well. I can, we can share it. We can talk about it when it's published. We can have her on. But yeah, her
Great. Yeah,
book
that would
is
be
currently
wonderful.
currently it's in Kurdish and Arabic, but it soon will be available in English too.
Are both books available on Amazon as well?
Unfortunately, my mom is not, but the Arabic translation of her book is available. The original Kurdish is not. My book is available in both Kurdish and English. I mean, in Arabic and English on Amazon.
That's it for today. Thank you so much, Sirwan, for being with us today and for sharing your insights and also your personal story and helping us, shed light on this very complex issue of the Kurdish experience and question in Syria today and also in the past. Um, just a reminder for our audiences that after this live session, the episode will be repackaged as a podcast and published on the New Regions website under the Watch section and on the New Regions YouTube channel and SoundCloud channel by tomorrow's end, most likely. And thank you so much to our audiences as well. See you in 2 weeks for the next episode of GeoSpace.